Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm. Today, we're going to talk about two things, one of which I think my audience might enjoy, and the other one I think they will hate. So I'm going to do both in equal parts to try to cancel each other out, because the last thing I want to do is actually bring on new listeners or become, appealing to the general public. So this episode is about that time back in the 2010s, the roaring 2010s, when I started a cult. And we're also going to talk about the meaning of life, because, let's face it, they're related. Anytime you run into a cult, you're going to run into someone looking for meaning, either the person who started it or the people who joined it. But let's not kid ourselves. Meaning, purpose, the whole search for why the heck am I getting up every morning? Why am I sucking down all this cheap, badly made coffee just so I can stay awake long enough to earn my 50 cents so I can eat for the week? What am I doing that for? And so we're going to talk about all kinds of meaning. What does meaning mean? What does the word cult mean? Was it really a cult? What did you do, Vincent? What crimes am I going to be admitting to in these episodes? Well, we'll find out. And if you're wondering, what was the cult's name? What were we into? Did we have uniforms? Was it the one with the shoes? I'm sure some of you remember the people with the Nikes who, they found dozens of them in a room. That was the Heaven's Gate cult. And they were very interested in extraterrestrials and the idea that humans were part of some sort of project and extraterrestrials were going to recycle the Earth because humans had failed on some level. And they believed that the Hale-Bopp comet, which was approaching at the time, was going to pick up their souls after they had taken measures to ensure that their souls would in fact leave their bodies, and they would rendezvous with the extraterrestrials at the Hale-Bopp comet, and their souls would be rescued, basically, and they would be some of the few psychic survivors of this failed experiment here on Earth. And that was the Heaven's Gate cult. I was always fascinated with them and can't help but have a certain affinity for their kind of thinking. I'm always ready to listen to or support somebody who is willing to go to the mat for what they believe. The person who's willing to discard their wealth and their friends and their happiness in order to further some moral or spiritual or philosophical project. I think that's something we should always pay attention to. But we were not the Heaven's Gate cult. We called ourselves Austin Naturalism. And there's a reason for that. If it sounds new and unfamiliar, that's precisely what it was designed to be. Because I did not want to form yet another atheist group. I was looking to inject something into society that would help develop a new kind of attitude toward philosophy and religion, because I was becoming concerned, as Nietzsche was, about can modern people survive without anything remotely related to God? Once you are fully committed to the modern project, the secular materialist project, you kind of run into a problem because it's very difficult to explain to people at that point why they should be doing anything at all for anyone. I had started to suspect that all materialist cultures eventually end up pointing a gun at your head to make you do what it wants you to do. just because they don't have any other arguments. A lot of religion is about, why should I suffer? And if I'm a human being who is doing the right thing, then I'm probably suffering more, because that means I'm worried about other people. I'm taking time to stress about the future of a community or a family or children that aren't even related to me. These are the things that people do when they're doing the right thing. They're giving of themselves. They're giving up potential wealth or future mates to do these little moral acts that we demand of people. But the big question is, why? Why should I do that? I will never forget being that little kid. I was around 10 years old, watching TV, and I saw a clip from a movie by Oliver Stone called Wall Street. It was Oliver Stone's attack on the world of finance and vulture capitalism. And there was a speech where the protagonist, Gordon Gekko, with his oily, slicked back hair and his expensive suit, he was talking to Congress about greed and how greed is good. And he believed that the drive for wealth was ultimately what would save the United States. And I remember thinking, as a kid, I just didn't understand how that could possibly work, because as clever t-shirts and memes would later point out, continual growth with no contraction is the strategy of a cancer cell. In an organism where cells have to work together to continue life, when one group of cells decides that they're going to use up all the resources just so they could reproduce, but for no other reason, they're just gonna do it. Common sense immediately screams out that a problem has occurred, that something has gone wrong, something's gone off the rails. And so Austin Naturalism was really about the why. And I chose the word naturalism because of a talk that I listened to by an American physicist named Sean Carroll. The point was, humans should consider the sciences and what we've observed about the natural world, but we should be committed to the proposition that it's not enough, that we have to build something on top of that, something that either adapts or reinvents or continues a lot of the older traditions of the world's religions or the old mystical traditions, because something's up. We all know that the secular materialist story is not the full story. And so my thought was, let's have some like-minded people get together and let's figure out a way to live life in this materialist world while understanding that there is more to the story. And we should be spending time and energy trying to build that other part. The other part that Gordon Gekko wanted to ignore. So we need to rewind the tape a little bit to set the stage properly. I started the cult Austin Naturalism in the early 2010s, but to figure out where my mind was and what my mindset was at the time, we're going to have to look back at the late 90s. A very formative time for me. Recall in the late 90s, I was trying to finish up my work at UT Austin, and I was still living in Jester Dormitory. And I remember watching a lot of this guy on Austin public access cable, which was, by the way, piped into our room. We had dorm cable, which was a very basic package. It included Austin Public Access Cable. So when Jason and I were bored or we weren't watching Jerry Springer, Jerry, then we would be watching this local weirdo named Alex Jones. And he had this very Texan, gravelly voice. And he was very angry about these people who supposedly controlled the government behind the scenes and were not really accountable to the electoral process or the Constitution. And he seemed to think that this group of people was heavily connected to the Clintons. And at the time, in the pre-9/11 world, when Seinfeld was all the rage, his message didn't exactly have a whole lot of traction. But something about him was compelling because even though I didn't agree with how he was connecting his dots, I was fascinated with the dots that he was presenting. Now, I eventually, in the very early 2000s, also did work with a group of people that eventually would lead me to that little building where they actually recorded Alex Jones's show, because I fell in with the Austin Atheist Network. Now, I'm sure that sounds strange to some people. The guy with the podcast that talks about the Bible all the time was part of some atheist group. Well, back then, I did have my edgelord, anarchist, libertarian, burn it all down and let the strong survive, philosophical, radical materialism, Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, plus Friedrich Nietzsche stuff. Yeah. And what that led to in terms of what actual stuff in the real world did I accomplish? Well, one good example is work I did with them to organize testimony and a showing at the Capitol to try to pressure the Texas School Board to adopt textbooks that included discussions of contraception and condoms. I thought that would be a good idea. While I was preparing my notes to make this episode, it occurred to me how much of the vibe changed. In the 2000s in Austin, everything was about the war on terror. Sam Harris was a big philosophy guy at the time, and we'll talk about him. And here I am having beer with guys who work the sound booth during Alex Jones's show. And they're telling me that he's actually a really laid-back, cool guy. And I find that fascinating. But what started to happen through the rest of the 2000s, as I approached the 2010s, of course, there were certain events and transitions that started to give me a less materialist, less edgelord worldview. And I think how the war on terror played out definitely affected things. The 2008 financial meltdown, the rise of comical wealth inequality. And by the way, my issue with that is not old-fashioned jealousy, as a lot of people try to frame it. Because in any free society, you're going to have some people that have more stuff than other people. Some people are just better at getting stuff and keeping stuff or managing their money. The problem is not who gets to buy a Lexus. It's who gets to write the laws. And so that's the issue. It's wealth's relationship to power that's the problem. If these radically wealthy people just want to go off and buy a bunch of jet skis and enjoy their wealth, more power to them. But when they try to go shopping for a senator, that's when my red lights go off and I'm thinking, oh, that's not good for us politically. And Aristotle pointed out that the size of a society's middle class is very indicative of its overall economic and social health. By 2010, I was fairly well established in my job, and it was becoming routine. I had 2 children. They were very young, but I was getting the father and paying bills and money stuff sort of nailed down, and I was starting to look at the next phase. Once my kids got into the job market or the marriage market, what would be going on at that point? And I was starting to realize that it is the prior generation's job to tell the next generation what's what. The problem is that they need to be accurate about that, and they need to allow for the fact that technological and economic circumstances can change. And so a lot of the advice has to be adapted for the future. And so I was just thinking, let's just do that with all of culture. Let's do that with the Bible. It is my job to transmit culture to the next generation. Here's where you are, guys. Here's where humans have been. Let's get you up to speed. Here's the civilizational project you were born into. Here's what can wreck it, and here's what we know helps move things forward. So I thought, let's get a group together of like-minded people. And boy, by the late 2000s, social media and Facebook and Craigslist and MySpace was already on its way out. But at that point, it was so easy to form groups and get in touch with people. And of course, now in 2025, we're sick of it. We're sick of hearing each other's problems. We're sick of people trying to get us to join their groups. Social media has sort of rotted out our social system to some extent. But back then, it was exciting and new. And the idea that you could get on Craigslist on your phone and you could find all these cool meetups and organize people, that made me very excited because I'm thinking, here's a case where technology is going to help me out. And so we started to meet. I just put an ad up on Craigslist. I came up with a cool logo, or at least I thought it was cool. But I was already thinking about something that would go on a t-shirt. Our first meeting places were at local tea houses and then parks when the weather was good. Sometimes sports bars. But we started to meet outside more and more. It almost became a thing that since we were Austin naturalism, that we would tend to be outdoors. And there was this idea that we were going to make the entire outdoors of Travis County our academe. We were going to make the green spaces of Austin our academy. Just like Plato's academy was actually a large outdoor space that was owned by his family. So in the late 2000s, early 2010s, an American physicist named Sean Carroll gives a talk about naturalism. I watched this on the primitive version of YouTube that we had at the time. The sound and the audio quality is not exactly up to par, but at the time, I was fascinated. Sean Carroll is a rarity among physicists, among popular ones, among scientific popularizers, in that he is American, very plain-spoken. He's not a Brit who lectures at Oxford. And he doesn't get himself into politics. The point of his talk was that the Abrahamic conception of God is not a functional hypothesis. It's not something you can formulate or test using the scientific method. The gears of physics work just fine with or without any kind of mind or intent behind the universe. He's right. This is something that we should consider, that the universe does seem to have a mind of its own. It's spontaneous, and it follows a set of rules that really seem to be very, very predictable. And so if there is this conscious mind that can change outcomes in the universe based on something like prayer or its own will and intention. If that's true, then there's clearly a tension between that mind and its ability to affect the universe, and then this relentless, predictable, mechanical quality that we see in the universe. In other words, sure, armies hire chaplains, and you could argue that they serve a very important purpose. But armies also buy a lot of bullets and a lot of bombs, because those things work very, very predictably also. So, here we have Gordon Gekko again, saying, look, materialism works. If materialism was such a joke, why did you spend your childhood in the 80s terrified of nuclear war? If bullets and bombs were so powerless compared to the power of righteousness or prayer, then why did I grow up hearing stories about evil thugs with guns lining up good people and shooting them in places like Poland or Cambodia or China? Clearly, in the war between prayer and contemplation and seeking God, and then making money, and then using that money to build stuff that kills people, and then taking power with that, the 20th century really gave us a lot of indelible examples of the bullets and the bombs winning, the thugs with guns winning, the people with the slicked back hair and the expensive suits winning. And so, now that we've had these disastrous wars in the Middle East, now that we've had a financial meltdown that revealed the inherent weaknesses in our system, what do we do at that point? Because we know that the universe is not all about bullets and bombs and mechanics. We know that in order to generate wealth, or even to enjoy it properly, there has to be some sort of meaning or purpose, or a sense of social belonging. Why are we working so hard? What are we buying this stuff for? Why do we want to be in charge? What do we do with our power when we get it? And so these are things that I was concerned about, and reading people like Sam Harris or listening to Sean Carroll or philosophers like Daniel Dennett, they were all pointing out the same thing, that Nietzsche's alarm that he sounded in the late 19th century, his concerns about the emptiness of the modern materialist worldview, actually were true and were valid and needed to be heeded. But the question is, what do you do? How do you adapt the old guiding lights of civilization to our new economic and social realities? Now that's a tough one. So, cards on the table time. Where am I with this God person, or this God thing? Depends on your definition of person. That's one of the first things I think you have to sort out, because the idea of a supreme deity looms large over this Western civilization project. And so I think the best way to talk about levels of belief in God is to bring up a guy that you may have heard of, a British biologist named Richard Dawkins. Now, he became a very cantankerous and ungracious man in his later years, a very frustrated and angry figure. But in his more energetic, idealistic, youthful era, I really admired him. He goes way back, a lot farther than his whole stint with atheism and early YouTube, and some of the books that he wrote about religion. His best book, of course, is his seminal work on biology from 1979. So yes, he goes way back. His book, The Selfish Gene, is something that's pretty awesome. It's almost like the philosophy of biology. But anyway, as a famous atheist, but also as a scientist who had to keep his possibilities open, he would say that he used a 7-point scale of atheism, where 0 would be a believer, because your level of atheism is 0. Then a level 1 would be someone who's pretty sure there's a God of some kind, but has some doubts. And then if we jump up to level 7, then that's someone saying, no way, dude, impossible, God can't exist, 100% atheist. Now, Dawkins, being a scientist, cannot be a 7 because the impossibility of God hasn't been demonstrated scientifically. And so Dawkins would say that he's a 6.8 and not quite a 7. And as you know, according to the philosophy of science, a relationship between a scientist and their most cherished beliefs has to be the same as Robert De Niro's character in Heat and the people that they love. Robert De Niro's character in that movie, Neil Cawley, tells Al Pacino that someone in his line of work, i.e., a super cool criminal, cannot allow anything or anyone into their life that they won't drop in 30 seconds flat if they see the heat coming around the corner. Similarly, Richard Dawkins has to be prepared to drop his atheism in 30 seconds flat if he sees any evidence coming around the corner. And Dr. Dawkins is correct to want to see a lot of evidence for the Abrahamic proposition because it's kind of wild. It suggests that there is a cosmic, conscious, disembodied mind that can remember your name and make plans and has intentions and can make things happen in the universe contrary to the basic materialist rules. Much to the credit of many biologists and neurologists, they are prepared to admit that we know almost nothing about consciousness and how it occurs and what it is. And because of that, we can't make the flat-out statement that consciousness is fully dependent on brains or nerves in order to occur. And even back then, I was fully aware of what they call the woo-woo factor in ufology, meaning all the strangeness about psionics and telepathy and the stories about NHI being able to control thoughts and put ideas in people's heads. And then MK Ultra. I had completely fried my brain in the late 80s and early 90s reading up on all that stuff. Coming to UT Austin and starting my academic career, I basically flushed that stuff. I basically thought, well, that was fascinating, but probably not true. But now, it turns out that that stuff never went away and is only getting more and more strange and is only encroaching more and more on what we would call real life. In fact, supposedly in 2027, there will be a full-on collision between the woo-woo factor and the weird world of ufology and the real Gordon Gekko material world that we inhabit. But that's 2 years away. Supposedly. Who knows? But I'm now in a weird position because the UFO phenomenon is providing some evidence or indication that consciousness can exist outside of a brain, and that there is some sort of universal awareness. There is something like a cosmic mind. even if it's not something that can form coherent thoughts yet, and doesn't know my name yet. But then again, if this universal awareness doesn't have a brain, it may not have a mind in the same way that we would define a mind. And so, even if this awareness does exist, does it meet the Abrahamic definition? Does it make plans? Does it know my name? Now, on the Dawkins scale, I'll say I'm a 5.6 on that. But notice that we're dancing on slippery ice here, because a lot of this depends on your definitions. And the UFO stuff brings up another issue, which is that our conscious experiences seem to have some sort of impact on the cosmos. And it has some sort of connection to this universal mind. We're not sure how much we can affect the future. And our effect on the future and what we've done in the past might be very important, because if some of the bizarre things we're seeing in physics are actually true, then we'll have to start thinking about the future as something that already exists. And we have to start thinking of the past as something that still exists. It never goes away. 5-year-old Vincent, wearing his Superman cape, still actually physically exists. It's in a spatial direction that is difficult for me to imagine, and there's nowhere I can point a telescope to see 5-year-old Vincent, but he does still exist. And my thoughts may have some sort of impact on the future, because they are sort of these inputs or stimulations on the universal mind that is non-local, and so has connections with everything, both past, future, and from one side of the observable universe to the other. So basically, the universe is kind of like a big stack of Polaroids, and we have to just sort of move from the bottom of the stack to the top, one moment at a time. But those moments don't actually go anywhere. We're the ones who are moving. It's sort of like our lives and the entire universe is like a Super Bowl that someone recorded on an old VHS tape. If we're watching the Super Bowl and I say, hey, I found a recording of this, I think I know how this ends. The fact that the recording exists doesn't mean that the choices and the actions of the players don't matter. It's just that the game already happened from one person's point of view, somehow, and the rest of us have to experience it one moment at a time. But really all that happened is somebody cheated because they know the future. And so a lot of people think, well, gosh, if the future already exists, then that means that my present actions don't matter. Well, no. The future that exists depends on your actions. It's just that we have to do things one step at a time, but the universe doesn't. And whatever the universal consciousness is, it bridges past, present, and future in a way that we don't understand. And so, I guess the best way to sum this up is what Maximus told his cavalrymen right before the battle with the Marcomanni at the beginning of Gladiator. He told them, "Remember, brothers, what we do in life echoes in eternity." That seems to be true. That seems to be the logical conclusion. I kept the ed short and sweet, and I used my logo. And the logo was essentially a kind of graphic of a tree, where the roots under the ground began to form a more fractal sort of elemental shape. It tried to communicate a connection between living things and physics, basically showing that what we see in the universe is a series of overlapping emergent phenomena that are built out of much more basic mechanical type processes. Something simple and evocative. Something that looked good as a vector graphic also, because remember, I was waiting to print these things on t-shirts. The ad was very open-ended. It just talked about, are you looking for a group where we can discuss these big issues and form a new dogma? Form a new basis of morality that's based on controlled observations and structured empathy. And it was clear that a lot of people didn't read or understand the ad. A lot of people basically thought we were an atheist group or for people who were deconverting, or people who were interested in promoting science education. But we also got some people who didn't fit the mold, and I was fine with them participating. There was a young man who had recently converted to Islam and was convinced that Islam was precisely the belief system we were looking for. And so we used that as a jumping off point until he eventually began to sense a kind of resistance to us converting to Islam. And so his attendance began to wane. We also had people showing up thinking that we were a naturist group. And that's something I had to go back and learn about because I wasn't aware of naturism. So naturalism is an approach to the universe based in observations of the material world and then proceeding from there to what you need to have a good life or to form a good society. But naturism is apparently a social movement of people who organize outdoor activities that they can conduct in the nude. So they're outdoor nudists, or it's related to nudism, I guess. That's what people thought. So pretty early on, I started thinking maybe the name was a mistake. But the first guy to show up to the first meeting, the very first meeting at Tivana in North Austin, only one person showed up, despite a lot of people responding through email. That was one thing I noticed early on. For every 10 really positive, exciting email responses, you'll get one of those people to actually show up face-to-face in person. And so this guy who showed up was one of the reliable regulars and a great guy. He was from rural Texas, just like me, and he had moved to Austin for school and work purposes, just like me. But unlike me, he was a preacher's kid who had recently lost their faith, and he wasn't interested in politics, and he didn't want to join any kind of atheist group. At the time, like I mentioned before, they were very political. They were focused on the dangers of the radical Islamic ideology that was seen as an example of religion causing huge problems in the world. And then also the Christian nationalist movements here inside the United States that they were working against. In particular, when it came to textbooks and, like I mentioned before, contraception in textbooks, but also exactly how are we teaching evolution and when? And can we mention this intelligent design idea? You know, it should have set off some alarms in my mind that my ad had attracted a preacher's kid, because Nietzsche himself was a preacher's kid. And it turned out that a lot of the people who gravitated toward the group or who resonated with the group were people who had been raised in a religious household, but then had a deconversion experience. Or they just could no longer believe as fervently all the statements in the Nicene Creed, for example. Some of those metaphysical propositions had become a little too cumbersome. Another follower was a young man who was an opera singer, and he was fascinating. He could always take the conversation in a different direction, usually in a way involving art or music that added something new to the discussion. And he came over to my house a couple of times. He was one of the few people who liked the movie The Master by Paul Thomas Anderson, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman and Joaquin Phoenix. I think it's brilliant. My wife, not so much. But probably the two most important or consequential members were a young couple in their 20s. They were both students. They were both from fairly wealthy backgrounds. He was a very serious philosophy student. He was a confident guy who could argue with anybody. He reminded me of myself. And his girlfriend was a very, very petite young woman who was studying random subjects in school just for enjoyment and self-development because, as she would say, she was unlikely to survive to middle age. So she wasn't interested in building a career or having a family. She was just thinking about life. And that's because she suffered from cystic fibrosis, which is a genetic disorder that changes the nature of the mucus that your body forms. And it causes a huge list of disabilities and health problems. And I got to see how difficult life can be for someone with this condition firsthand. And it's a doozy. Now, I recently did some checking, and it turns out that treatments for cystic fibrosis have apparently improved dramatically over the last 10 to 15 years. So that's good. Her idea of not surviving to middle age may not be as firm of a conclusion as it used to be. I'm a terrible person, so I have not checked up on her or any of the followers since the group ended. But I hope things turned out as well as they could. She definitely suffered from depression, and her concern about how to deal with her depression caused a disagreement between her and her boyfriend and me, because he and I had different opinions on what she should do. And it really taught me a lesson about be careful what you wish for. If you want to be a leader, beware that people will definitely put life decisions in your hands. And you have to be ready for that. Religious leaders in the Abrahamic traditions have a lot more tools to help them console or encourage people who are dealing with extreme adversity in life. I didn't have a lot of those. But there's a problem at the foundation of the Abrahamic traditions also. It's the big secret. It's the elephant in the room, so to speak. And this has to do with that meaning and purpose stuff that I was talking about before. And so, yes, the young lady with cystic fibrosis was a big influence in my thinking because she was a great example of the challenge of leading people in terms of interpreting culture or helping them figure out how to deal with the difficulties of life. But the big problem you run into is that you can prove mathematically that there is no ultimate purpose. There is no highest purpose, ultimate goal, highest good. And you can prove it. It's simple math, simple logic. You prove it the same way that you prove that there is no last number. That the set of integers, for example, is infinite. And you prove that through contradiction. So, in your proof, if you let x equal the last number, such that there is no number larger than x, you write that on the board. X. There's our number. Well, the problem you've got now is that I can come along and write x plus 1 underneath that. And the fact that I can write x plus 1 proves that x is not the last number. So there can't be a last number, because you can always add 1 to any number somebody hands you and says, hey, I found the last number. All you have to do is slap a plus 1 on it, and you proved them wrong. And likewise, let's imagine that X is the meaning of life. Let's say I found the purpose of life. I figured it out. It's X. You got to do X. That's all you got to do. Well, the problem there is all you have to do is ask, why do I want to do X? What's so great about X? What does that accomplish? So, let's take this to the Abrahamic traditions. And in those, the meaning of life, the purpose of human existence, is to serve God's plan. God's plan is the highest good, so living according to that would be the highest good. So if you want to do anything at all, the best possible action is to follow God's plan. And if that plan involves suffering with a debilitating illness, then that's still the highest good. But the problem there is, you can always ask, okay, but why do I want to do that? Why would I want to serve the highest good? Why do I want good things to happen? Why would I want to go to heaven and achieve the best possible existence? Boring. I know it sounds like I'm being silly and sarcastic, but it's a serious question. To some extent, the Abrahamic religions are just saying, look, this is the best you can do. It is that way because it's built that way. And the issue there, though, is that at that point, you would have a difficult time demonstrating that an eternity of torture in hell, in a literal lake of fire, would not be the best possible existence. And you might be thinking, dude, it's torture, so how could that be good? Pain is bad, right? Well, not so fast. The Abrahamic traditions make it clear that God does not view the world that way. God does not see pain as inherently bad. Pain happens. Sometimes pain is a great motivator. Sometimes pain is the best teacher. Now, in the lake of fire, there's no purpose for the suffering other than an inescapable consequence of some kind, but there's no teaching going on in hell. So you could make that argument that suffering an illness on earth as a human in the flesh can be instructive. And it may have some effect on the universe or culture or the people around you or their descendants that is important. You could also see it as the development of the soul of the person who's dealing with the illness. So you can see, there are places you can go. After all, we'll have to do an entire episode on the book of Job, because that is all about God's plan and how sometimes it's not the most pleasant plan for the people involved. So it turns out that being a cult leader ain't easy, but it's necessary. So I'm chasing new acolytes like Tom's chasing Jerry. Well, in the next episode, we'll continue to talk about the people that I met and some of the conflicts I ran into. And of course, we'll talk about our greatest peaks and then what caused the eventual dissolution of the group. Overall, I can tell you that I learned that people have a deep and desperate need to belong to something. And that something is a group of people that serve some kind of cause. Whether that cause is beekeeping or bird watching or guarding the nuclear missiles on a submarine, it doesn't matter. As long as it's an organized social activity where you're relying on other humans for resources and leadership. So that's one thing I learned about starting this group, is that people need groups. And if you think that cult leaders like Jim Jones killed a lot of people, that's small potatoes compared to how many people have died from groupthink, or just plain chaos, or mob rule. The lemming type thinking that sends everyone running over a cliff for no particular reason. I also learned that leadership requires telling people things that are hard for them to hear. The young woman with cystic fibrosis was a challenge because I realized that I didn't have a good story to sell her. I felt a need to try to make her feel better about her situation, but all I could really do in the end was to challenge her intellectually and provide a social environment where she could find some extra resilience in the group that we created. So, we'll talk about our rise and fall in the next episode, and a little bit more about what I think I learned about religious beliefs in general, and what kind of belief system might take hold over our future. And so, more on that in the next episode. Until then, talk to you later.